In this video, Jordan Peterson talks about the radical left ideologies.
The Road to Wigan Pier, which is a great book. And Orwell spent a bunch of time, I believe in the 30s, with coal miners in the northern UK. And I mean, those people, man, they had a hard life. You know, the coal miners would go out in the morning and then they would have to crawl down a tunnel way the hell underground to work. They couldn't stand up in the tunnel because it wasn't tall enough. So they started their workday, which was very long and arduous, like 12 hours long, by crawling 3/4 of a mile on their hands and knees just to get to where they were going to work. And they didn't get paid for that. That was just like the morning exercise before you got to, you know, take a pickaxe and hack coal out of the walls for 12 hours and then crawl back home. And breathing in coal dust the whole time so that you were, you know, an old man by the time you were 45 and had black lung. And the working conditions were absolutely appalling. The companies owned all the houses. They charged the workers as much for rent and food as they made, except a little bit more, so that not only were they paying all the money they were making back to the companies, but they were falling into debt at the same time they were doing it. So, you know, it was no joke. And so it wasn't like Orwell was blind to the basic horrors of that. He wrote a phenomenal book detailing out their working conditions, you know, as an on-site observer, but then he followed it up with an essay. And the essay was, well, given the undeniable misery of industrial working class life, why is it so difficult for the socialist philosophy to become prevalent enough and widespread enough in the UK so that it has some permanent power? And his answer to that was, well, it's because most of the people who are leading the working class political movements don't care one bit about the poor. They're just mad about the rich. And I thought that's dead on. And I also think that if you ever do an analysis of any sort of political movement without factoring in the effect of resentment, you're just not paying any attention at all. The question isn't who do people like, who are they supporting? The question is who are they attempting to oppress with their support of someone else? And it's just as true on the right as it is on the left. I'm not making any comments at the moment about the right because at least on university campuses we've already decided that the radical right is morally intolerable. They can't even show their face, whereas we're perfectly willing to accept the radical left, and that's something that never fails to amaze me. It also never fails to amaze me that people don't even know that it's amazing, you know, because I know, because I've asked students this year after year after year, the number of students who know what happened in the Soviet Union or in China during World War II pales in comparison to the number of students who know about the Holocaust, for example, even though they might not know that much about the Holocaust.
Yeah, I was wondering myself, like, I don't know if you can shed light on it, but when I first really became aware of the free leftist when I was listening with you detailing some of the stuff in the Gulag. And so, yeah, I was wondering, why don't we get taught about that in school?
That's what I'm trying to explain. Like it's, well, then I'll go a little farther with it. I mean, part of the reason that Orwell wrote what he wrote, he was really the first Western intellectual who woke up to what was happening in the Soviet Union. And he basically woke up in the 1930s. Now, it got complicated, too, because in the Spanish Civil War, just before World War II, the good guys were the communists, right? Because there was a split essentially between the radical left and the radical right in Spain. And the radical right won. And so Spain was basically fascist until 1982 under Franco. And Franco was an ally of Hitler and Mussolini and so forth. And so during the 1930s, it was considered quite heroic if you were, I would say, a young intellectual to go to Spain and fight on the side of the left. And I think that kind of set the moral tone in some sense, because I think you could make a case that in Spain the left-wingers were the good guys in that particular struggle, even though it's not obvious by any means that they would have stayed the good guys if they would have won the war. So I think part of it is that among intellectuals, the idea of the left as freedom fighters took quite strong hold in the Spanish Civil War, I mean, I know that's where Orwell, in part, for example, was exposed to it, and the romance of that continued. But so that's one possible answer. The other one, I think, is the communist universalism. I think that fascism was an anti-intellectual movement to its core, whereas communism wasn't, and it was often led by intellectuals. And it was really an intellectual doctrine. Whereas fascism, I would say, was fundamentally an emotional doctrine or a dramatic doctrine or something like that. It was a lot more primordial because it was race-based fundamentally. So Jung believed that the fascism in Germany was a reawakening of pre-Christian paganism, roughly speaking, like blood-based tribalism. And so he thought of it as a regressive movement, and I think that that's certainly a position that's worth considering. The communists, they laid out a rational description of their upcoming utopia, and it actually made quite a bit of sense from a rational perspective, because when you start with a proposition like, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, first of all, it sounds attractive, because the proposition is, well, you should obtain what you need from society. So if you're in trouble, or if you're sick, or if you're hurt, then there should be a backup for you so that you just don't fall out of society and perish. And by the same token, why not ask of people what they can contribute, so that the stronger people and the more able people contribute as much as they can, and the less able people contribute as much as they can, and in some sense there's something that's universally fair about that. Well, as a set of logical propositions, it's not self-evident that it's wrong. So, and I would say that certainly in Russia, for example, which was basically serfs and aristocrats, at the point of the First World War, because the Russians were just crawling out from beneath a czarist monarchy that was basically medieval in nature, that was pretty attractive. The question is, the problem was, who attractive to who? And the way it played out in practice, and you can just imagine this, for example. So imagine that there's a village, one of the things that happened in Russia, in the Soviet Union, was a process called dekulakization. And the kulaks were, the kulak was a name given to the farmers in the Soviet Union who were, say in a given village, who were reasonably prosperous. And so those might be people that have a brick house and who have been running their farm for whatever reason well enough so that they could have a few employees. Now, one of the propositions of the radical left in the Soviet Union was that if you had any capital, so that basically if you had any excess money at all, and that would be enough money maybe to buy a brick house and to improve your machinery and to hire a couple of people, that fundamentally what you had done was stolen that from the labor of the proletariat, of the working class. And so then, and you can understand that, because that's a Marxist idea. The Marxist idea was that labor produces excess value, and that what capital does is vacuum up that value and basically steal it. And so there's never really any appreciation in the Marxist doctrine that there are creative things that can be done with capital itself, and that labor is actually rather difficult to define. Like a good example of that is with, say, you think about Bill Gates. I mean, it's not easy to make the case that Bill Gates made $70 billion by exploiting his workers or his customers. It doesn't seem to me that that's an accurate description. Now you can argue about the details with regards to certain monopolistic practices and so forth, but what I saw happening with Microsoft, because I'm older than you guys and I watched what happened, the computers really kicked in about 1993, although we were using them fairly extensively by 1985. The net kicked in 1993. What happened before Gates was that programs were sold one by one, and they were unbelievably expensive. So a typical word processing program at the dawn of the computer age would have been approximately as much as the computer was, which was way more expensive than they are now. And what happened with Gates was he bundled programs together, that would be the Microsoft Office suite, and dropped their prices by a factor of probably 20. So all of a sudden, poof, everybody had Microsoft Office. It was a brilliant marketing ploy. I mean, what happened was that he noticed that the price of software rapidly plummets towards commodity level, right? And he just accelerated the process. So my point is that regardless of what you think about Bill Gates, the idea that he got his money merely by stealing it from the labor that produced his products is not, it's an unsophisticated approach. It's not self-evident in the least.